In 2003, it was discovered that Iran had started a nuclear weapons program, but they were soon persuaded to discontinue it. In 2007, U.S. intelligence reports stated that Iran had restarted their nuclear weapons program and broke their agreement to cease nuclear research. Iran has not provided enough information of their program and has still not allowed International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. For 20 years, Iran has hidden its uranium enrichment program, forcing the U.S. to pass 6 resolutions for them to stop enriching uranium. The U.S. strongly backed this and put its own sanctions on Iran. Iran eventually agreed to suspend some of its nuclear program in 2013, but it was only a partial deal. Iran says it is only trying to use its nuclear program for research on nuclear energy, but many think that they have an ulterior motive. It is thought that Iran wants to start making nuclear bombs, but the United States and other foreign countries are strongly against it because of their unstable government and position in the Middle East. In this crisis, it is important to find a balance between political relations and military safety. In June 2015, Obama made a historic deal that would end the 20-year conflict. On January 16, 2016, Iran stated it had moved the core of its reactor and filled part of it with concrete. UN nuclear inspectors visited and announced that Tehran had made its requirements to the deal made in June. These are great steps in creating lasting peace and safety in Iran, in the Middle East, and around the world. It is all based on years of distrust and conflict between Iran and the rest of the world, but mainly the United States. There is a clear parallel between the Iran crisis and the Cold War. There are many similarities between the two nuclear-based conflicts. Both issues involved the fear of nuclear weapons being used. In the case of the Soviet Union, the United States feared its ever-growing stockpile of weapons would be used against them, causing mutually assured destruction. U.S. and the Soviets participated in an arms race that created over 70,000 nuclear warheads. In the modern event, Iran had just started to develop the technology necessary to create a functional weapon, but the fear still remains. The result of the Cold War was increased tension and difficult decisions having to be made both politically and militarily. The same tough decisions are still having to be made with Iran today. When nuclear weapons are involved, it is frightening for everyone in the world. The issue between the Soviet Union and the United States got bigger and bigger until it was almost too late to prevent a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a particular event in the Cold War where nuclear missiles were literally staring the United States in the face. In the Iran nuclear crisis, people fear that the same type of conflict is bound to happen if the situation isn't under control. Thankfully, the Iran crisis is being controlled in its early stages, suggesting that the world has learned from history. The theme between these two events is militaristic because it involves a threat of military action to other countries.
The U.S. involvement in Syria has a militaristic theme. It is easy to come to this conclusion due to the fact they had a civil war and are now a part of the ever-growing threat that is ISIS. More than 250,000 Syrians have died in the 4.5-year civil war. It all started with an anti-government protest and has escalated ever since. Even chemical weapons have been used on both rebels and civilians. Over 11 million people have been displaced from their homes. More recently, the terrorist group known as ISIS has been taking land and waging war in Syria. The American public has been strongly against being involved in Syria. Many think it is not America's place to get involved and is not worth American lives. Even with an anti-war public, a U.S.-led coalition launched airstrikes in September 2014 in attempts to destroy and get ISIS out of the country. Russia launched its own airstrikes targeting terrorists in Syria. Many believe they are targeting Western-backed rebels and civilians. Peace talks began in 2014. They were called Geneva II, but broke down soon after 2 rounds. This was because Syrian government officials refused to discuss opposition's demands. The U.S. has already sent in special forces to train U.S. allies and have bombed Syrian targets. They support the national coalition and the moderate rebels. Even with this effort, the U.S. is getting pressure to step up and get more involved. The only hope in recent years is peace talks and ceasefires that have started in 2016. Each group is getting represented and the UN is coming up with plans to create future and long-lasting peace in the nation. With the instability and intricate relationship in the country, it is hard to tell if this will pan out. This event shares similarities to the Civil War in Vietnam. After a brutal civil war broke out, the country was divided between the South and the Communist North. U.S. involvement began in 1961 when the South signed a military and economic aid treaty with the United States. This treaty led to the arrival of U.S. support troops in the same year. Anti-war protests broke out, and the public was completely against the war. For years, support troops were stationed in the country only to aid the South, but it developed into a full-scale war led by the American military. Like in the Syrian Civil War, America started bombing areas controlled by the enemy. However, in Vietnam, only a year after the bombing started, 200,000 troops were deployed into the country. By the end of the war, 550,000 troops were stationed in Vietnam. 60,000 of these young American men were killed in a war that dragged on for 20 years. These staggering numbers make getting in between a new civil war worrying. More modern events, like the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, make civilians even more worried that Syria will be the next country America invades and takes major military action in, possibly becoming the next Vietnam. What was the situation in Vietnam before you got there, and what did the American people know about it?
What was the situation in Vietnam? I'll tell you the truth, I'm not really sure. People really didn't know about it because it was going on since like the Kennedy administration in the 60s.
Yeah.
And it was like all like hushed up, and it really didn't come to the head until I guess where people really understood what was going on was the Tet Offensive of 1968, when the North invaded all the bases in the South.
How did you get involved in the war? Were you enlisted or drafted? How did most of the men that you knew get involved?
Most of the men were drafted. I was going to be drafted. My friend was being drafted, so I went in with him on a buddy system. And he went his way, and I went my way. So I saw him through basic training, and then after that, he went his way, and I went my way. So,
Because you signed up for the war, were you able to choose where you got to go, or were there any advantages over being drafted?
no, none whatsoever. I had friends that were drafted, and they never left the United States. I had friends go to Germany, and there was no priorities or anything. It was wherever they sent you, that's where you went.
What were some of the experiences that you had in Vietnam, and what were some of the tasks you had to do over there?
Let's see. Experiences. I got to meet a lot of great people, and it was like everybody was the same, if you know what I mean. It doesn't matter whether you were white, black, Asian, whatever. Everybody was the same. But then, in 1968, when Martin Luther King was killed, things kind of changed, and not for the best. Not that everybody went bad, but a lot of people were really upset with the killing of Martin Luther King, which changed the closeness and the camaraderie that the people had. It was more like if your unit, you were close with your unit, but in the other times when you were at a base or whatever, you could just walk up to anybody and everybody was friendly. But then after that, it just sort of changed.
What were some of the military tasks you had to do throughout the war?
Most of the things I had to do is usually transport stuff to different LZs, which were fire bases and helicopter bases and stuff like that. Basically, I was trained as a mechanic and really never did any mechanics. I had to supply our home base with water. just basic everything. I don't know what to say.
Were you able to stay in contact with your friends and family at home, and how did they feel about the war?
Nobody really talked about it, but I was able to stay in contact with letters to my cousin, my mother, and numerous other people. And then I did actually get to phone home when I went on R&R to Hong Kong. And then I did one, they called it a Mars thing, where you signed up for radio, like ham radio operators, and they would, go to one radio to the next radio to the next radio and get in contact with the home number. But that sometimes took like a week or 2 weeks, so it was very expensive.
Yeah.
Back in those days.
How did your view of the war change from before you got drafted, during the war, and then after you were home for a while?
I really paid not too much attention to it before I went in. I thought I was at the right place doing the right thing. And then when I got home and realized that it wasn't a nice thing that I was supposedly had done, it was sort of just put at the bottom, and I just tried to blend in with people.
We are connecting this to the Syrian civil war now, and I was just wondering if you knew anything about the conflict and if there is a possibility it could turn into the next Vietnam with American involvement. What is your opinion on it?
My opinion of what's going on in today's world, where we go into these countries, like we went to Iraq and we lost people and we abandoned it, and it fell similar to Vietnam. The whole thing is being politically correct, and is not the answer. If you're going in, you're going to go in and you're going to just go in and, guns flaring. That's it. No. How can I put it? The people who are there and fighting, they use civilians as collateral. That we don't attack them. It's like we don't know who's who and whatever, and they hide behind the civilians. So, just my opinion, we shouldn't be involved in this stuff because we can't do what we really should do. Like I said, we got to help the world, but it's like I just don't feel like trying to go in and try to do ground fighting is worth it. I mean, we have the power to put an end to all this stuff.
Do you think a more peaceful way of going about solving these conflicts would be better, like talks and ambassadors and stuff like that? Would that be a better solution than going in there militarily?
That would be a great solution, but it doesn't work. We are a good country and all that stuff, but we're not very well liked because we can be pretty cruel. It's like it would be nice if you could do it, but the only way you're going to stop these people is just stop them. And it's tough to say on what we could do. And they do hide behind civilians and stuff like that, and it's they're basically cowards because the leaders are hiding. They're not out there doing whatever the troops are doing. In Vietnam, the officers were out there.
The demand for changing minimum wage has flooded the news. The theme of this change is economic. With the election coming up, many topics are brought to light, and one of the major ones this year is an increase in minimum wage. It is thought that most states currently have a minimum wage that is not a livable wage. The nation's lowest wage is $7.25, and while most states are even higher, it is still not enough. Currently, New York City has raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the rest of the country is fighting for the same. New York State has also signed a bill that would raise wages to $15 an hour by 2021. Other cities and states who have a $15 minimum wage or who are expected to have one soon are Missoula, Montana, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Greensboro, North Carolina, Portland, Oregon, Milwaukee, Oregon, California, and Washington, D.C. Possibly the biggest chance for change is presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who proposes a plan to raise wages to $15 an hour by 2020 nationwide. Even if he is not elected, he's not the only government official who supports the change. Without a law passed on a national level, the people making minimum wage will most likely be trapped in poverty. 30% of the U.S. workforce earns about minimum wage, a wage that comes out to $15,000 a year, and that number is before taxes are taken out. With the federal poverty line at $22,000 a year, this means 30% of workers are in poverty or have to work multiple jobs just to get above it. Without federal assistance, this large group of people would be in a difficult financial situation. The low minimum wage we see today can connect to the economic practices of the past. Labor rights were almost non-existent in the past. With the growth of cities, workers were forced into sweatshops and were making a barely livable salary. The first large U.S. labor union was established in 1866, but soon collapsed without making any progress towards better labor rights. There were few restrictions on businesses and barely any rights for workers. Thankfully, in 1869, Knights of Labor was formed with a membership of 700,000. It made major strides to end child labor and demanded an 8-hour workday. The largest change was seen after the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It established a 40-hour work week, the first minimum wage, overtime, and outlawed most child labor. It can be seen throughout history that workers need to stand up for their rights, and the modern increase in minimum wage is no different. America has seen improvement from the workers' rights laws that have been passed. Minimum wage has not changed fast enough, so it is clear to see it is the next big change necessary to ensure a fair work environment.